Because I'm using fabric with a unique color palette for my next bra and underwear set, I'm going to be dyeing my notions so they match perfectly. And today I am going to show you how to dye your own fabric using acid dyes. Before we dive into acid dyeing, I want to discuss all the other dye options and when you would use them. I'm going to use acid dyes because my notions are synthetic, more specifically nylon. I'd recommend acid dyes for anything synthetic besides polyester. If you do have polyester, a dispersed dye is necessary. That is what is in Rit Dymore's line, and although it says it's non-toxic, I would not recommend breathing in the fumes when you are setting the dye, so a vent or doing it outside would be best. If your fabric is cotton or another natural fiber, fiber-reactive dyes work exceptionally well. Lastly, if you have a fiber blend, I tend to just dye whatever the highest percentage fiber is, but Rit dye would work for that as well. I'm still not ready to jump into dyeing because I need to test my materials. Each material will take up the dye differently, so it is best to do some testing. The biggest problem I've encountered with dyeing synthetics is a mottled dye take-up, which can be desirable or not. If you don't like the mottled look, then simply stirring the dye bath will help a lot. I will admit I have a large selection of dyes and custom colors because of my previous fiber dyeing business, so I have the colors that match the tartan very well. Chances are you do not have a library of swatches, so order more fabric or notions so you can test your colors. Since I'm going to be dyeing a few small quantities of notions, I'm going to be using mason jars in a crock pot. If dyeing a larger piece of fabric, you can use an enameled or stainless steel pot, but do not use aluminum. You will also need a thermometer. Other materials include the dye itself, along with either vinegar or citric acid. I'm going to be using vinegar. To measure the dye, I'll be using a scale and weigh boats, but measuring spoons work as well. You'll also need measuring cup for liquids. For PPE, I would recommend a mask when working with the powders, as well as gloves for the entire process. One thing to remember is anything that's used for dyeing should be kept for dyeing and not be used for food again. Let's start by making the acid solution. I'm adding 5 teaspoons of vinegar to 500 milliliters of water. This can be set aside while we mix our dye. There are 2 numbers you can play with to get the desired color, the depth of shade and the dye concentration. Today we are going to be using the standard numbers of 1% for depth of shade and dye concentration. Dye concentration is how much powder is added to make the dye liquid. Depth of shade is how much of that dye liquid is added to your acid solution. The example dye concentration of 1% means that for 50 milliliters of water, I need half a gram of dye powder, which I got by multiplying 50 by 0.01. Now that we have our dye concentrate mixed up, we can figure out how much of this concentrate is needed to achieve 1% depth of shade. The amount depends on how much fabric is being dyed. For example, if we are dyeing 10 grams of fiber, that means we need to add 10 milliliters of dye concentrate to get 1% depth of shade. The last thing that needs to be calculated is how much of the acid solution should be added to the dye. To get that number, we just take the amount of fiber being dyed, multiply it by 30, and subtract out the dye concentration. For our 10 grams of fabric, we will need 290 milliliters of acid solution. I know this is a lot of math, but I promise you it is worth it to be able to dye the exact same color again in the future. At this point, I am finally ready to dye my fabric. So I'm going to wet it in warm water, making sure it's completely soaked through before adding it to the dye. I do not have my ball jar lids anymore, so I'm using plastic wrap and a rubber band to close up the dye bath. Then I add water into the crock pot to create a water bath and turn the heat to high. You can start checking your dye solutions after 45 minutes. If the water is clear, the dye has been set and the crock pot can be turned off. Sometimes not all the dye will be taken up into the fiber. When this happens, I turn off the crock pot and let the fiber sit in the dye bath so it slowly comes down to temperature. Sometimes the rest of the dye will be absorbed into the fabric, and other times there's just too much dye and the fabric cannot bond with it. Once everything is cool, the fabric needs to be rinsed thoroughly, dried, and I can continue with this tartan lingerie sewing project. If you're interested in the exact dye recipes I used, I have a blog post which is linked below.